You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Fellas, you know Degree Cool Rush deodorant, right? Well, last year they changed the formula, and guys were mad about it. One dude even started a petition. So guess what? Degree heard us, admitted they messed up, and brought the original Cool Rush scent back exactly how it was. And it's in Walmart, Target, and other stores now for under $4. So grab some and remember why its cool, crisp, and fresh scent made it the #1 men's antiperspirant for the last decade. Degree Cool Rush is back, and it smells like victory for all of us.
Oh my God, it's the coolest thing ever. Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? Well, check this out. It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic, famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. Seriously. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. Today, I'm joined by Lynne Olson, the author of The Sisterhood of Ravensbrück, How an Intrepid Band of Frenchwomen Resisted the Nazis in Hitler's All-Female Concentration Camp, which might get the award for longest title of a book that I've interviewed for on the podcast. Lynne, how's it going today?
It's going very well, thank you. May is almost over. June is almost here. That's exciting. I love summer. So
it is a nice time of the year for sure. Speaking about not nice things, I guess this is an awkward transition, but you wrote a book about Ravensbrück. But let's start with the simple question of what was Ravensbrück and what made it special?
Right. It was Ravensbrück. It's pronounced Ravensbrück by the Germans, and that's the German. I use the German pronunciation. Ravensbrück was the only all-female camp, concentration camp in Germany. There were many others. Some had women, some had men, but Ravensbrück was only women, and it's really been forgotten. It's interesting. I have written. This is my 10th book, and most of the books I've written have been about World War II. So I'm very familiar with Ravensbrück, as I am with the other names of the other concentration camps. But I've been really surprised to discover that virtually nobody has ever heard of it before. That wasn't why I wrote the book, but I just found it really interesting, that it really has been forgotten.
It is kind of interesting, among sort of the concentration camp system, there are some big names that people remember. Often, of course, quite rightly, some of the extermination camps. But there were a lot of camps all over Germany and Eastern Europe during this time that it's really easy to forget like how extensive that system was. In your book, of course, everybody who is at Ravensbrück has a unique story, but you do kind of pick out a couple of specific stories to kind of follow throughout your book. And you kind of structured your book around those people. One of them that really struck me that is kind of, I guess, a main character throughout your book is Germaine Tillion. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. So who was she and how did she end up at Ravensbrück?
My main focus in this book is to write about Frenchwomen who were in the French resistance, who were sent to Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück, there were about 130,000 women altogether, and most of them did come from resistance movements throughout occupied Europe, not just France. I mean, it was, Poland, Russia, the Netherlands, every occupied country did have its own resistance movement. And so many women from all those different countries came. But I focus on the French women because of what they did. They basically banded together to help each other survive and then to resist the Germans. And the woman you named, Germaine Tillion, was really probably the leader, or certainly one of the leaders of this group. She's a fascinating woman. She was in the 30s and 1940s. She was an anthropologist, one of the very few women anthropologists in France. And she had spent years in Algeria, in the mountains of Algeria, studying Berber tribes, Arab tribes. She was basically France's version of Margaret Mead. And so she had spent most of her time outside of France and only went back to France when the Germans invaded, at the same time the Germans invaded France in 1940, May 1940, June 1940. And she was outraged by this. She was one of very few members of people in France who actually thought about resisting right away. I mean, everybody was shocked, particularly the French, when the Germans not only invaded but occupied the country within just a couple of weeks. Nobody expected that. Everybody thought the French army was going to be able to roll over the Germans. Well, that did not happen, and so basically everybody in France was totally shell shocked. But there were a few, like Germaine Tillion, who did say, no, this is outrageous. Our government capitulated to Germany. That is outrageous. We have to stand up and fight. So she was one of the organizers of the first resistance organization in Paris. So this is early. This is, like mid 1940, the summer and the fall of 1940. And she was very active in this group, and was finally arrested in 1941 by the Gestapo, and it ended up at Ravensbrück. And she is important because as an anthropologist, she was trained to study, civilizations, to study how societies work. She did that in Ravensbrück. She really was able to detach herself and really conducted a surreptitious study of how the SS had organized the camp, and basically figured out that if the women who came there, if they understood that if they banded together, if they formed a sisterhood, if they formed close friendships and helped each other, that they had there was a possibility of survival. But she didn't do just that. I mean, she also said, okay, once we're still alive, then we have to resist the Germans in the camp, which, on the face of it, you kind of throw up your hands and say that's impossible. But in fact, they did. She wasn't the only one who came up with this idea, but she really, thanks to her scientific training, as I said, she was able to really kind of step back and look at this horrific environment that she and the others were in and try to figure out a way living through that horrible time. And it made it huge. Her advice really really had a big impact on the French women that were coming in. She was one of the first French women sent to Ravensbrück. So as new convoys of French women were sent to Ravensbrück, she and other older resistance members who were there basically told them how to live. And as a result, they did, in fact, form that sisterhood.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see kind of throughout the book how a community forms, right? In a really bad situation, a community still forms, and they still, there's still people who are banding together, maybe isn't the right word, but they're obviously caring for each other, and that literally helps them survive in the worst of situations.
Exactly. As I said, she kept emphasizing the importance of the closeness of the friendship, and they did it in all sorts of ways. I mean, obviously, they helped each other. They to get food. If somebody was sick, they took care of them. They also, and I found this really interesting, one way of their resistance was to basically get together and recite poetry and sing. All of this was forbidden, at Ravensbrück. They weren't even supposed to talk to each other. They gave lectures. I mean, Germaine Tillion was a great anthropologist, and she gave, a lecture series on the history of man, and others who were musicians or artists or whatever talked to everybody about what they were doing. So that, it's all sorts of things that went into their becoming a community. It didn't happen. I mean, it happened every day. That it was an ongoing thing that they felt that they could and did rely on the others to keep them sane and also to keep them alive.
We off? 30 seconds of carefree bliss.
Oof, like wind in your hair carefree.
Oh, like using Clorox Disinfecting All-Purpose Cleaner in the home carefree.
Yes!
Like dog slobbing on the coffee table and cleaning it with Clorox Carefree.
He's on a roll now.
Spit toothpaste on the faucet.
You got it. You got it.
Peanut butter on the light switch.
Oh, spritz, spritz.
Spritz, spritz. Clorox, man. Clean feels good.
Okay, we're back.
Use as directed.
Home means something different to everyone. But with Rocket Mortgage, home can mean even more. It can mean a college education, taming your high-interest debt, even a renovation. We've made it easier than ever to use your home equity. That home you worked so hard for, now it can work hard for you. Call 800-4ROCKET or visit rocket.com to find out more.
Rocket Mortgage, LLC, licensed in all 50 states, and MLSConsumerAccess.org, number 3030.
Kind of in that same vein, one of the interesting stories, just a little part of the book, is about a group of prisoners that I believe referred to as the Rabbits, or you refer to as the Rabbits. Could you talk a little bit about who that group of women were, and then sort of the events surrounding their, I guess, hiding in plain sight, kind of from the SS, from the death squads, I guess.
That's a fascinating story. The Rabbits were, most of them were young Polish prisoners. That's another thing that I think most people don't know. That actually Poland had the most active and effective resistance network of all of the countries of Europe. It was very, very well organized, and many, many people belonged to it, including a lot of women. And these particular young Poles, most of them came from Lvov, and they were sent to Ravensbrück. The Poles probably had the largest population of any of national group at Ravensbrück. But anyway, these young Polish prisoners were sent to Ravensbrück, and they were chosen as guinea pigs in horrendous medical being conducted by doctors at Ravensbrück, which was, it's a long story why they started doing this. It was basically to test the effect of drugs, sulfa drugs, on injuries, war injuries. And what they did was to take these young women, many of them were still in their teens, and they operated on their legs. Operated doesn't even describe what they did. They slit their legs open and inserted bacilli, germs, all sorts of bacteria, to see what would happen. And then some were given sulfa drugs, some were not. They didn't stitch their legs up. I mean, it was really just slicing them open to the bone, putting this in. And a number of these young women died right away. But the majority survived, but they were almost all of them were crippled for life. It was just horrendous what they did. And they meaning these doctors, continued to do experiments like that, not just to test sulfa drugs, but to see, okay, if we break their bones, or if we take out this part of the bone of a leg, what will happen? So they continued doing these awful experiments. And the Poles finally resisted. The young Poles basically said, that's enough. And by that time, the camp was kind of really uniting around these young women. And so they actually did stop those experiments after about a year. Toward the end of the war, all these experiments happened pretty much in the beginning of the war, to the middle of the war. Toward the end of the war, it was clear to the young Poles and everybody else in the camp that the Germans were probably going to execute them before the war was over, because they didn't want any witnesses to what these atrocities that had been carried out. And sure enough, in early 1945, the word went out. I mean, there was a great intelligence grapevine at Ravensbrück. So women, got word of what was going to happen before it happened. And the word went out that on this particular day, I think it was in February of 1945, that they were going to execute these. I think there were about 60 to 70 Polish women still alive who had been subject of those experiments, that it was going to be held the next day. So we're like about 5 months away from the end of the war. The whole camp came together and decided, we are not going to let this happen. The French women were the ones who really kind of led the effort, but everybody, every nationality joined in. The Russians were incredibly, active in this. So overnight, the word went out to various barracks of what was about to happen. And plans were made to smuggle these young women out of the barracks they were in before the executions could begin. And so this is literally done overnight. This is, within less than 24 hours. So the next day arrives, the word comes out that the SS are coming for these women. Trucks are being driven down to the barracks. Executions, or the roundup of these Polish women, was going to take place at the early morning roll call. And so all the women were supposed to gather in front in this big square for the roll call as the SS men were marching toward them. And as the trucks were coming up, the floodlights on the square suddenly went out and they became totally dark. These young women were smuggled out of their barracks and hid. They had already, the plans had already been laid where they were going to go. Some were hidden underneath the foundations of barracks. Some were hidden in between the roof and the ceiling of barracks. Others were, it was an enormous camp. And so they found hiding places for all these kids, all these Polish women. And so for the next 4 months, it's an unbelievable story that they managed to hide all these women, these 60 to 70 women, get some of them out, and the Germans couldn't find them. They tried their best to find them, but they couldn't find them, and all of them survived. It's such a rarity for a rebellion like that to occur, much less be successful. But it did. And, as a result, they were in very bad condition, some of them, when the war ended, but they did survive. And the story continued after the war, when the French women conducted a campaign of almost 10 years to get the West German government to pay compensation to these Polish women for what happened to them. It took them almost 10 years, but they did win, and the West German government finally did. It's the ultimate story of, what can happen if you form a sisterhood, that you actually you can accomplish things that nobody would have expected you to be able to do.
I think a really important part of that story as well, like for people listening, and like you cover this in the book, but sort of how that could happen. You have to remember that during this late war period, during 1945, like these camps were bursting at the seams from how many people they were piling into them. So that makes it a lot more, that gives you a lot more opportunities to hide people when there's so many people in these areas.
Exactly. And Ravensbrück really bore the brunt of that because, as I said, it was the only all-female camp. And so as Ravensbrück was one of the last camps to be liberated. So as the Russians are coming toward Germany, they go through Poland, which is where the extermination camps were. And so a lot of the Polish extermination camps, like Auschwitz and virtually all of them, were liberated many months before Ravensbrück. So the Germans didn't allow those prisoners to be liberated. They marched them out, and they marched them to other concentration camps. And so, thousands of Jewish women, for example, were marched to Ravensbrück in the final months of the war. So by the time, the war ended, there were like 40,000 women that had been sent to Ravensbrück. And many of them had not even been, there had been no registration of them. the whole administrative structure of Ravensbrück had collapsed. And so, probably tens of thousands of women who came into Ravensbrück, they were never recorded. Their names were never recorded. Many of them died. A number of them survived. But as you say, the kind of chaos of what was going on there made it a lot easier to hide. But it also made it almost impossible to survive because there was almost no food. Disease was rampant. And at the same time, they were murdering people in the gas chamber. They were doing their best to kill as many as the SS, kill as many as they could before the end of the war.
Speaking of the end of the war, obviously the story of these women does not end in May 1945, and so you cover a lot of kind of their post-war lives, right, in your book. And one of the things that happens after the war is some of these French prisoners from Ravensbrück, they form kind of an organization or a society that I'm not going to try to do the French for, but it's the ADIR is the acronym. So could you talk a little bit about the ADIR, kind of the role that these women had in putting it together, and then what the goal or mission of that organization was?
One of the reasons I did this book is not only to talk about Ravensbrück and what happened there and what these women did, these French women, to survive and then to resist, but also to show what happened afterwards, because I think in many ways that was just as important. Yes, I'm just going to call it ADIR. That organization was created right after the war, and the members were women who had been either in German prisons or in German concentration camps. And the reason for organizing, there was a twofold reason. One was to provide the help, the support that the majority of these women so badly needed when they came out. They were in terrible physical condition, as were the men, but they were in terrible physical condition. Many of them, a number of them died on their way home. Many of them died shortly after. So there was a really critical need for health care, which this organization provided. They also provided job assistance. They provided financial assistance. Many of these women, were totally had lost everything in the war. Had lost sometimes their husbands, their fathers, their sons, whatever. They lost their homes, and so this organization helped these women get back on their feet. And just as important, it provided emotional support to help these women. Virtually everybody who went to Ravensbrück, which is probably true of everybody in a concentration camp, suffered terribly psychologically. They had PTSD, writ so large that how could you possibly go through the horrific experience that these women went through without being terribly, terribly damaged emotionally, psychologically? So that was incredibly important. So basically, they helped save the lives of hundreds of women who had been through either a prison or a concentration camp. But that wasn't the only reason. And as important as that was, it was basically to put the French public on notice that women were to be recognized too, that women's contributions in the resistance to help free their countries were just as important as those of the men, that they suffered and sacrificed just as much or more as the men, and they were not being given credit for it. It was in reaction to the fact that when the war was over, or even toward the end of the war, and when the war was over, that men basically claimed all the credit of the resistance and basically delegated women to the background, which was not uncommon because France back then, and to some extent still is, was a very traditional, conservative, patriarchal society in which women were regarded as second-class citizens. And so that sexism in the society was very evident in the resistance movement as well. And so as a result, women really were given back of the hand by Charles de Gaulle and his Free French and male resistance leaders. And basically this organization was there to say, we're not putting up with this. We did it too. We were just as important as you, and we demand recognition and compensation. Well, they never really got compensation, and they were never given as much recognition as they should have. But it was really revolutionary for the time, particularly in France, because they were basically saying, we are telling you that we are going to be in control of our lives, not you. And that organization, actually, ADIR, continued and was incredibly active until the early 2000s, until basically all the members had died. But it was extraordinary and continued to be very, very active in helping each other. As the women aged, they could count on their friends from Ravensbrück to take care of them. It's an amazing story.
For a modern person reading this book, what beyond the kind of the incredible stories of these women, their suffering, what do you want modern readers to gain from reading this story that you've written?
I'd like people to recognize that enormous power that ordinary citizens have, even in the worst of times, and this was certainly the worst of times, the power that they have if they come together, if they form a community to combat evil. By yourself, you're helpless. It's hopeless. But if you can create a group, and you can fight back, as they proved, in the most unbelievable conditions, they did fight back, and they were successful in doing so. And I can't. It's a very timely story now, I think, because we are, I think, in a way, repeating a lot of what happened in the 30s and 40s. Their story, I think, people today can really take a lesson from.
Well, thank you for joining me here and talking about your new book.
Well, thank you.